Well, thank you very much for coming out on this 4th of July afternoon on this Independence Day. We are really honored to have the Palestinian Prime Minister here, Salam Fayyad. I can say with some authority that I've known a lot of the good guys and a lot of the bad guys in the Middle East, and this is one of the really good guys. So it is so it's a treat to be here with you, Prime Minister, and I'm really been looking forward to this conversation. I actually wanted to begin by not asking you the usual Hamas Obama question, but ask you something that as long as I've known you, I've actually never really known, which is, where were you born? What have you been doing for all these years before you became Prime Minister? And how did you become Prime Minister of this nascent state of Palestine?
Story of my life in 2 minutes.
Story of your life in maybe 5.
Well, first of all, happy 4th of July to you and everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I was born 1952 in the West Bank town of Nablus. Just born there, lived most of my childhood days.
What did your parents do?
My father was director of agriculture department in Nablus.
The agricultural department in Nablus.
Up until...
So for the Jordanian government, you'd have been working?
Yes,
yeah.
until 1967.
Uh-huh.
Lived most of my childhood days in Tulkarm, another small town in the West Bank. And then in 1968, we traveled to Amman, Jordan, because my father had to go to then Abu Dhabi before it became UAE, to work as director of agriculture there. That's where I finished my high school.
In Amman, or in Abu Dhabi, or Amman?
No, in Amman.
Uh-huh.
And then I went to the American University of Beirut after that, where I did my first degree.
In what?
In chemistry, in biology. While doing that, actually, during my junior year, I discovered that I really wanted to do something else. Economics, that happened around the time of the first oil crisis, if you remember. And there was
1973.
1973 and all. I was junior at the time, and I thought this is what I really wanted to do. I wanted to find out what this business of economics is about. Everybody was talking about it. That's the beauty of the American system of education. You could do that as an elective. I tried that, and I liked it so much, and I thought to myself, why am I doing this chemistry business? But something about what was going on in Lebanon, Marwan Mashar is in the crowd, and we were together at the AUB. Something that was happening in Lebanon around that time told me, even at the young age of 21, 22 years old, that something not right was happening, and that if I had changed majors, I just might not be able to actually get a degree from AUB, something which people generally felt was a good thing to do, to get a degree from the American University of Beirut. So I decided to actually finish my first degree and then do graduate studies in economics. I did apply for that. Sure enough, by the time we started doing it, what then became known as Lebanese Civil War had begun, and it became too much of a luxury for me to seek postgraduate studies at a time of such great difficulty in Lebanon. So I left Lebanon, came back to Jordan, where I worked first as a volunteer in an orphanage, waiting for things to normalize, to go back to Beirut to continue with my studies. Of course, those of you who know the situation in Lebanon know that that war went on for another 15 years. So I then decided to begin to do something other than just volunteer work. I worked in business for a while, about 3.5 years.
What kind of business?
All the while trading, contracting, and projects. During the oil boom, there was a lot of that going on in the Middle East. It was good business to be in. But notwithstanding the success I had, something about going back to school just never left me. I wanted to do that, to get that degree in economics. So one day, just like this, I was sitting there and I decided, unless I do it today, I'm not going to do it ever. I called another friend of ours, Marwan Mashar knows him, actually, who had before me left the AUB for the United States to study something in pharmacy administration. I said, I'm coming to the States, I want to do postgraduate study in economics. He said, well, it doesn't work like that here. There are deadlines for application, things like that. So I said, well, anything, just get me anything. And he was in Austin, Texas at the time, and there was this other school other than UT Austin that offered an evening program, MBA program. I said, I don't want to do MBA, but well, I'll do a semester of this and then transfer. I ended up actually doing the full MBA degree, coincidentally, at a college called St. Edward's University in Texas. After which time I finally, ultimately, moved to UT Austin to do that degree, which I really wanted to do. And it turned out to be everything I wanted it to be. It was fun, did it with a great deal of enthusiasm. And while doing it, as a matter of fact, I got a job offer to work at the Federal Reserve Bank St. Louis. Except that I couldn't do that because I was on scholarship by a university in Jordan, and the requirement was that you go back and teach after you do this sort of thing. So
you could have been Alan Greenspan, actually.
Well, I was honored to see him this morning. Not in that league, no, sorry. Anyway, so anyway, I did go back to Jordan, taught for a little while, ended up going back to St. Louis as a visiting scholar. I liked it very much there. While doing this and thinking as to where I was going, got married along the way.
Is your wife American or Palestinian?
No, she's Palestinian from Jerusalem. While I was there at St. Louis, I got an offer from the IMF to work there, and I took that. It happened around the time when I was getting married, and I thought to myself, you know, Washington would be safer from that point of view, because being in St. Louis, with my wife coming from overseas, if she was going to just sit, wait for me all day long, was not going to be, it was not going to work out very well. Washington, you know, there are a lot of people there, cosmopolitan and all. I ended up working at the IMF beginning January of 1987 and stayed there until mid-90s after Oslo process had started, and that was really another important turning point in my personal life. Around the time something started to be known about Oslo, with a lot of people traveling to the Middle East and to our part of it, for that matter, to act as experts, particularly in economics, that's when life started to be not too happy for me.
So you got drafted into the Palestinian...
Yeah, here I was, you know, working in Washington at the IMF, having my coffee on Sunday afternoons, the porch, Reston, Virginia. Something about this did not make that much sense with experts from all over the world traveling to our part of the world to help us. So I very much wanted to be a part of that. Coincidentally, and fortunately, it happened to be around the time when the IMF managed to get permit from government of Israel to set up an office in West Bank and Gaza. And I was chosen as the first IMF res rep to the Palestinian Authority. A good friend of mine, Stanley Fisher, had something to do with it. He was then first deputy managing director of the IMF. Now he is governor of Bank of Israel, as everybody knows. In an event, I ended up being there initially for a 2-year assignment.
In Jerusalem?
Yes, living there, but working with my office in Gaza, shuttling between West Bank, Gaza, etc., doing what the IMF does, making life a little bit miserable for authorities we deal with, trying to get them to do finances right and things like that. In any event, it was highly rewarding. You know, it gave me an opportunity to work as a profession, my own profession, but also doing it for a very, very good cause, for people I belong to, and one of, it could not have been better. And the 2 years became 3, and 3 became 4, and that's when we started to run over that which is customary. You know how it is with these sort of diplomatic missions. I mean, there is a time limit beyond which you cannot continue to do what you're doing. So then came the time for me to ship out of there and to go back to Washington if I had wanted to stay with the IMF. But, you know, given what this was about, you know, I was not about to actually you know, go back to headquarters and all, and I opted out of IMF career to stay in Palestine. That happened around 2001 or so. Ended up serving a very long 6-year period, term as res rep. So I resigned my job with the IMF to become a banker in the private sector. That lasted a few months.
You can't keep a job, Salam. It's
Yeah, lasted 2 months. It was fun. It was, I mean, for those of you in banking, it's something to really think about because, bankers have a tough life, contrary to what many people think. But in addition to things bankers usually have to worry about, most of the time credit risk, they're, acting, operating in Palestine at the time of breakout of the Second Intifada with violence and all, curfews, incursions, military operations, and what have you. Operational risk was a lot more prominent source of concern than credit risk. Things as basic as moving money, cash, from one branch to another. Those used to be, the kinds of preoccupation I had to contend with every day. And here was new to the profession, really never was a banker before, did not have formal training for it, but then having to worry about which branch is open today, which city is under curfew. And, it happened around the time of great challenge. Actually, we started to see one branch after another close. And I was the head of the largest bank there, the Arab Bank. It was very, very challenging and demanding. In the midst of all of this, there were calls first from within the Palestinian Authority, but then they coincided with a large push internationally for reform of Palestinian Authority. There was an important session that was held by the Palestinian Legislative Council in May of 2002, where they demanded new government and changes and all, and that was around the time when there was a great deal of interest internationally in having things done right by the PA in the governance sphere. I was called in by our late President Yasser Arafat and asked to become Minister of Finance in a government that was to be represent big change. Much to many people's surprise, I accepted to do this. And obviously not for glamour of it, to be honest with you. It looked virtually impossible, just like many things I ended up doing later after I joined the PA. But then what started out being a big government change involving many portfolios, and that's what really gave me a little bit of an inkling as to how things happened there. It ended up being a fairly limited government change, about 4 portfolios and all. Nevertheless, I ended up joining the PA in June of 2002, first as finance minister. Luckily, given my background, I knew what had to be done and went about doing it as quickly and efficiently as we could possibly do it. And in the process, introducing major reforms and major changes in the way business was done. And I can tell you with honesty that the basic elements of the public finance system, functioning public finance system, were put in place during that period, which is something that not many people know.
Accountability, transparency.
Yes, and this happened, while President Arafat was still alive. Many people, associate reform with the post-Arafat era. Not true in finance. I can tell you for the record, for history, it started with earnest in the summer of 2002. We did a lot of things. By a year later, most of everything that had to be done in terms of the basic elements of reform were completely introduced. The system subsequently came pretty much undone after the elections of January 2006. I was away from government. I resigned. Yes, Hamas took the government for a year, March 2006 through March 2007. I was away from government then, during which time I ran for office and I joined the PLC as a member along with Hanan Ashrawi on a slate called Third Way, put together in haste and all. In any event, I was away about a year. A year later, I rejoined the government in the so-called National Unity Government that was formed after Mecca Accord.
Mecca Accord between Hamas
between Hamas and Fatah, yes. And that government lasted about 3 months, almost exactly 3 months, 17th of March 2007 through 17th of June.
Hamas takes over Gaza.
Hamas takes over Gaza in mid-June 2007. I was called in on 13th of June to see Abu Mazen, President Abbas, in Ramallah. I was at a commencement function for our eldest son, Khalid, who is now a sophomore at Texas, University of Texas too. And I was having been given the honor of being the keynote speaker for that function.
Wow.
And literally, as I finished delivering that speech, I was told to go to Ramallah. I knew bad things were happening, obviously, but it's something I had to do. And I was asked that fateful evening if I would not put together an emergency cabinet.
Become Prime Minister.
Yes, and I don't know what people make of this, but it was not time to do much thinking about anything. It was time of great emergency, and to this day I get extremely emotional when I think about those days. Not the easiest of time. Our country was going down the tube, Gaza gone, West Bank not far behind. Not really the kind of time or moment in your life where you get the privilege of thinking about and consulting family and all. So I did that, and I served in that capacity since then, except that in May of this year, we put together an expanded government, and that's where we are. I don't know if I managed to do this in 2 minutes.
That was wonderful. That was fascinating. Yeah. I think everybody appreciated that. Prime Minister, let's pick up really where you came in on the scene, because I think one of the big questions out there is, can there be a Palestinian decision without a Hamas-Fatah unity government? And if there can't, what are the prospects of such a unity government?
It need not, technically speaking, be a unity government in the sense of factions sitting on it. What it needs to be is a form of a consensus government, which could mean, technically, a government of non-partisan cabinet officers.
Right. Be technocrats.
Technocrats, with the consent, or at least non-objection
of Hamas,
Fatah, or anyone else for that matter. I thought for a long time that was the best formula, and not because I happen to be non-partisan, an independent. I thought it best because it was very clear to us that Hamas was not about to change its platform, political platform, in the areas that matter. Vis-a-vis Israel, and specifically vis-a-vis the commitments that the PLO had entered into on behalf of Palestinian people in September of 1993, involving, number one, recognizing Israel's right to exist in peace and security, and number two, renunciation of violence. These are important commitments into which the PLO had entered into on behalf of all of the Palestinian people, at home and diaspora. And these are commitments that it was clear that Hamas was not going to subscribe to. Given that, and given the fact that they represented a significant chunk of the electorate, how do you govern under conditions like this? Clearly, a Hamas-only government did not solve the problem. They tried their hand with it for a year. It's not theory. We have experience with that. And during that year, the entire PA was subject to major financial boycott. People think of this in terms of official assistance not going to the PA, but that's really not the issue. I can tell you for sure that in the course of 2006, the PA had received more assistance, more official assistance. I would say 3 times as much assistance as it had received in 2005, before Hamas's accession to power. It was not really the issue. Because, while money did not come from, let's say, OECD donors, United States, European Union, some money came in from the region that more than made up for the difference. The issue and what crippled the government and its capacity to function, I would say the PA as a whole, was the financial siege, meaning that banks, commercial banks, could not deal with the Palestinian Authority, with the institution of government. And you cannot run a public finance system without using the banking system. You cannot run the affairs of a country on cash transactions. That's one of the things we had eliminated, actually, during the first wave of reform we had introduced over the period 2002, 2006, 2005. And I say this glossingly, but it was a major reform, because one way in which the PA had conducted finances before was to pay salaries to security in cash. Many other such reforms. In any event, the PA did come under financial siege, and that really contributed to bringing the system pretty much down in terms of transparency, in terms of knowledge of what was going on. And it also restored something we were very hard to eliminate completely, extra budgetary spending. There was no reference to anything. So there's virtually complete breakdown in just about everything. Total loss of transparency. I mentioned to you about external assistance, official assistance. One of the very few facts that are now known as to what has happened or what had happened in public finance area during that period. So that's basically, so we know what happened when Hamas was in power. What is less known and less understood actually is what happened during the tenure of the National Unity Government. That was interesting. And the history of it is not understood well, and I think some of this is intentional.
So this is the government that followed the Hamas tenure.
This is the government that followed the Hamas tenure after everybody realized that this Hamas-only business is not going to work out. So the best thing to do is to try to put up what you call national unity government. There was a lot of dialogue on this, and that was sponsored by Kingdom Saudi Arabia, and the most recent, the last round of which took place actually in Mecca itself, the holiest of places for the Muslim world. Great symbolic importance to this. The involvement by the king himself in doing it was something of great importance and significance, symbolically and all. And then there was not really full agreement on the political platform in terms of language. And a lot of it, really, a lot of the discussion revolved around finding language that sort of was workable or acceptable to everyone, while at the same time appearing to be consistent with those obligations. And this is one part of our history which I really think should be studied carefully for future reference.
Why?
For one thing, it was the first time for me personally, and I happen to know a little bit of English and as much in Arabic language. First time in my life that I realized that I had to really draw a distinction between observe and respect. We got into this business of semantics and language in ways that are absolutely insane.
And this was all about how to create a language that Hamas would come into the government but wouldn't violate Palestinian commitments to recognize.
Here we are, we get formulation that says the language that this government will honor, respectful, will honor agreements entered into by the PLO on behalf of Palestinian people. But somebody, the intent there was honor is something less than observe. And then why bother with all of this? Either you agree or disagree. This is really.
Let me try to bring us up to date then, because elections are scheduled in January by the Palestinian Constitution. So let me try to ask you this question.
Can I just back
for I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Because this is a 3-month story. I can't tell in 1 month. 1 minute. Because it fell. That government actually...
That government of Hamas,
that government
fell.
actually lasted only 3 months.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people there say it came down because of the siege. What I really want everybody to know, not so. Not so. The financial siege on the PA was beginning to be broken. I was the Minister of Finance in that government. And even though technically the government was boycotted by Europe, by the United States, certainly by Israel.
Was in it.
Yes, because Hamas was in it, and because somebody drew the distinction between observe and honor. Anyway, nevertheless, we were beginning to make inroads on breaking the siege, and the government, in my view, was beginning to act and was beginning to be seen as a working government, one that really actually did not that very much look like Hamas or act like a Hamas government. And maybe that's what brought it down, to be honest with you. Not the siege itself. Yes, it would have been easier had the world received that government with open arms and said, yes, we recognize you. It would have been easier for the government. But the government did not fall under the weight of the siege. That's not true. That's not true.
Would you say it fell because Hamas wanted it to fall?
Well, internal problems, for sure. As I told you, the government did not act like a Hamas government. I was on that government, and I made sure so that everybody understood where I was coming from before I joined the government. I gave an interview, and it's on record, to Newsweek, just after it became known that I was going to be on this government. And my name was in that Mecca Accord, actually. I said Minister of Finance. So not much of a decision-making involved on my part. So it was over with. I felt it important to make my position clear. So an interview I gave to Newsweek magazine literally a couple of weeks before I formally joined the government, I clearly stated continued commitment to those obligations and commitments that the PL had entered into. And the reason I did that so publicly was so everybody knew where I was coming from. I did not want, colleagues in government, after the government is formed, to really say, you change your mind or anything like that. This is a different government. I made sure I gave that. Shortly after I joined that government, I took an op-ed, actually, I believe, in LA Times, after I was in that government. And here I was, an officer on that cabinet, in which I stated, I've always subscribed to all of the commitments entered into by the PLO on behalf of Palestinian people, including recognition of Israel's right to exist in peace and security, and including renunciation of violence. And I said, I still do. You know in your business how it is with op-eds. The editors of the paper wanted to take, I still do. I said, give me back the op-ed I want. The main reason why I'm publishing it is because I want everyone to know that things have not changed. I was in that government. So that government really actually did not look like a factional government. It started to act like a pragmatic organ of the Palestinian Authority. It was beginning to make inroads. Things were beginning to happen. But then it really fell down because it just simply didn't look like the government that Hamas had wanted.
So elections are slated for January 30th under the Constitution.
Yeah, January 25th, I hope.
End of January. Let me ask you a question to try to put it in a regional context, Prime Minister. If we look back at the Middle East now over the last, since the American invasion of Iraq, you could say that America decapitated the regime of Saddam Hussein. It was, I think, instrumental in pushing Syria out of Lebanon. It was instrumental in getting Mubarak to loosen up a little bit in Egypt. And it was instrumental in pushing the Palestinian elections that brought Hamas to power. And what you can see in all four of these theaters is that when the lid got loosened, the parties that first were able to take advantage of it were all the Islamist parties. In Iraq, it was Skiri. In Lebanon, it was Hezbollah. West Bank, it was Hamas. And in Egypt, it was the Muslim Brotherhood. It seems to me over the last couple of years, you've had a very interesting backlash. That the Islamists ruled. I think they messed up and they overreached in a lot of areas. And you've had a kind of interesting moderate backlash. We saw the pro-Iranian party decimated in the Iraqi provincial election in January. We saw Hezbollah defeated in the Lebanese election. We saw what happened in Tehran. And I sense, and this is really not my question, is that same backlash now happening in the West Bank and Gaza vis-a-vis Hamas? Therefore, if there were elections in January, how do you look at that? Do you see the elections as an opportunity for the kind of moderate mainstream to do what happened in Lebanon, to do what happened in Iraq, to do what happened in Iran in the West Bank?
I agree with describing in a former case, the one where Islamists ascended to power, certainly in Palestine and other places, as a backlash, in the sense that anybody who drove against traffic would have won those elections. It was more a reflection of unsettlement, unhappiness.
With the Fatah regime.
With status quo, generally, whether in Palestine, whether elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that actually is really more like an ideology. It combines elements from far left to far right. What combines them all is rejection of status quo. After decades of disenchantment with status quo, a lot of things go into this, including not only lack of settlement politically of the overall issue, but also social injustice or sense of social injustice, inequity, poor governance, ineffective governance, and the rest of it. That is, I think, something I can go along with describing as a backlash. It may be the latter wave could be described as a backlash. I hope not. I hope it's really more.
If elections are held, though, in January, who do you think will win? Will Hamas be able to sweep these elections? Will Fatah, the more mainstream movements, be able to make a comeback? What are the calculations of whether or not elections will or should be held?
First of all, this is not January. We're still six months away from that, 7 months. And God knows what may be happening then to alter or to influence the calculations, influence people's decision making. But an analysis of what had happened in early 2006, I think there is pretty much consensus on the factors that led to rise to eminence of Hamas and groups like Hamas. One I mentioned, I mean, just basically unhappiness with status quo, it having failed miserably in delivering on promises and all. And, you know, the history of this is long and is very well known without really getting into it. And with the way, you know, the world, the powers to be, including Washington, viewed the world and dealt with third world countries, whether in the Middle East, whether in Africa, whether in Asia. But that's history. There are other elements, as a matter of fact. You know, Fatah had been in power, whether in the context of the PA or as the dominant faction within the Palestinian political system, that's the PLO. And before then, there are the failures of the political process. There are the failures of governance that everybody knows about. Corruption and perception of it and impropriety.
But would you like elections to be held?
Definitely.
You would.
Elections in January of next year are a constitutionally mandated right of the Palestinian people, and they should be held in January of next year. Period. No discussion. I think, you know, when people are talking about early elections, that's a different matter. Right. Early elections require consensus. Sometimes they are provided for in constitutions of countries. Sometimes the head of state has that power. In Palestine, the head of state does not have the power to call early elections. One of the shortcomings of the system, as the legislature for a while was working on weakening the presidency, we ended up stuck with a system where nobody can short-circuit elections or call early elections. So early elections require consensus, but constitutionally mandated elections in January of 2010 should happen. That's an absolute right for people. They should happen. And I think that ought to be the driving force and part of the political effort that should be mounted in order to make a win by people who and factions of a persuasion that's based on a sensible approach to governance, sensible approach to delivering, you know, the Palestinian people that which we desperately need, freedom, where they would have much better chance of winning. One way of doing this is actually to act on behalf of the people and in their interests. And one way in which you can do that, specifically in this case, is not to act, and certainly not to be seen as acting, as getting in the way of people enjoying that which is an absolute right, to have elections. So clearly, this is part of the overall political effort that should be mounted to win people over. It is no secret that Hamas does not want elections in January of next year.
Because they think they'll lose?
I mean, I don't know what other reasons they may have. That seems to be...
It's usually a pretty good reason not to have elections.
that seems to be the calculus there.
So let me ask you this then. Does Barack Obama, President Barack Obama, know something about how to resolve this problem that George Bush, Bill Clinton, you know, George Bush Sr., that others didn't? Or is his force of personality, his style, as manifested by his speech in Cairo, even if we have the same old policies, itself a huge advance, so we can create maybe a better atmosphere for those January elections? Are we on the right track?
You know what I think is different? I think what he has is the benefit of the experience of the past attempts at making peace in the Middle East. That's what he has, for sure. I mean, style is always, you know, an integral part of the equation, certainly. But the substance of it, I believe, and what I believe is driving it, certainly like to believe this, is the benefit of experience of nearly 16 years of trying to do this unsuccessfully. And I say this analytically, and I say this because of what I perceive to be as a matter of very sharp focus on what I call elements of success, rather than just only the grand picture of getting there.
So building more from the ground up.
Right. What needs to happen? I mean, as one of my professors in economics was fond of saying, you need to have potatoes to make potato chips. And really...
So what are those potatoes from a Palestinian point of view?
The potatoes from the Palestinian point of view are the institutions capable of delivering good governance to the Palestinian people. The institutions of the Palestinian state in the making.
Be specific. Which ones that you think are important?
Security, law and order, justice, public finance, economic management, welfare, all of the functions that any responsible state should feel obligated to provide, to deliver to its citizens. in all spheres of governance. You know, this is about building towards statehood. I mean, this is what I view our key obligation as being. One of really actually preparing for that day when we are really on our own, only if we can get there.
So if you have
that's what we really want.
You'd have the institutions,
Yeah.
and you just need the borders, in a sense.
Definitely. You know, I tell you what drives me personally, what conditions my thinking about all of this. And it really started long before I became Prime Minister. In fact, when I joined the PI as Treasurer, as a Finance Minister, I mean, let's do all of those things. You know, people were saying at the time, you know, the Americans, the international community, after the roadmap, the quartet, you know, they want these reforms, they want the PA to do all of these things. And my message all along to people was, the world wants us to have a good public finance system, but is that against our interest? What's wrong with that? Let's do that. I mean, we need to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, every time we, you know, take a step in the direction of having a function of a state performed competently, you know, it means a great deal to us, and to me personally, for sure. It should mean the same thing to any official anywhere in the world. But to us Palestinians, it means a lot more. Because with every step that we take in the direction of institution building, that's a step closer toward freedom, toward statehood. That's what it is about. So therefore, that's what really drives this process. These happen to be our potatoes, so to speak. These happen to be our obligations under the roadmap. Roadmap is about security, is about security for Israel, but it's about security for Palestinians. It's about governance. It's about enhancing, ensuring capacity of Palestinian people to govern themselves in all facets and spheres of governance, including security. That's what this is about, and that's why we took it upon ourselves. Particularly after what happened to us in mid-2007 with the fall of Gaza to Hamas, with the West Bank at the time being under such a state of complete and utter lawlessness, we took it upon ourselves to really actually be serious about state building, get people to rally around the cause of state building indeed. You know, if this is about statehood, then let us build toward it. I do not need anyone to remind me that we are doing it under occupation. I know that. But we are doing it because we are under occupation in spite of the occupation to end it. Unless we actually do it this way, unless we create the state as a fact on the ground in a positive way, in the way that I'm saying it to you, and in a way that we mean for it to be positive facts on the ground, in response to adversity, in spite of the adversity, to end the adversity. So that 2 years from now, I estimate, technically, and those 2 years happen to mean something politically too, given what everybody must be thinking about politically, because things are linked. Within 2 years from now, I hope it will not be difficult for anyone to look toward us and come to the conclusions, indeed, the Palestinians do have a state, but for the occupation, if in fact it's still around by then. And if it is, for it to be the only thing that has to change. I mean, if we do that, we'll have succeeded. That's our message. It's a progressive message. It's a positive message. It is independent of what might be said by way of detraction or distraction here, there, or everywhere. Now, on the Israeli side, the potatoes consist of also things that make sense relative to the key deliverable of the peace process, ending the occupation, words of George W. Bush, ending the occupation that began in 6/7, and the establishment of independent, viable, sovereign Palestinian state roadmap language, alongside the state of Israel, peace and security. That's what it is. Relative to that objective, focusing on governance as a key requirement, the potatoes on the Palestinian side, makes sense. Similarly, with the obligations of the potatoes on the Israeli side being comprehensive settlement freeze, it makes perfect sense. Why? Where is that Palestinian state going to emerge if settlement activity were to continue? Obligations on the Israeli side also include, importantly, stopping military incursions in areas under security control Palestinian Authority. That too also makes sense. And now it's compelling. The case for it is compelling, with us having succeeded so remarkably in establishing law and order in the West Bank uniformly throughout all urban areas in the West Bank, at a time when not many people gave us much of a chance to do so. So we have made progress, given emphasis and focus on the requirements for success. I believe that's what's new.
That's very good.
And I think that's what we really should all unite and support. focusing on the elements of success, because we're just not going to get there in one leap by wishful thinking. We really need to build toward that.
Do you feel that, it was very well said, do you feel that do you feel that in Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have an Israeli Prime Minister who appreciates that there is a new Palestinian strategy, that it is making headway, and that he can and will contribute to it, assuming you deliver on the security side? Do you feel that Netanyahu gets it?
I can only hope so. And I really would hate to think that the politics on either side would continue to drive this process forever in the wrong direction. Because good part of the failure is due to that, and is due to time wasted on speculating whether or not there is a partner here or there is a partner there. I invite everyone who thinks in those ways to look in the mirror. Let's all, live up to the standard. Let's all measure up. Let's all do what we all have to do, and each focus on those requirements. Look, the roadmap did not say, who begins what first when. I mean, it said, you Palestinians have to do this, you Israelis have to do that. A lot of time was wasted on who goes first and who goes second and all of that. And we all paid dearly for it, Israelis and Palestinians alike, the region too, because what happens there is not something that the region happens to be insulated from. Indeed, the world at large. So, I call on Israeli leadership to basically do what has to be done. I call on us to do what we have to do. And what I like about the new paradigm, if it is that, and I hope it is for us both, for both sides, to be expected to deliver. What I believe is happening here is the yardstick on accountability had just been raised. It should be. The bar has to be raised. We both should act with much greater sense of urgency. We both should feel accountable. Look, we can't do it alone. Everybody, will tell you that. But that should come at a certain price. It should mean something. If I say that we need the United States to help us with this, it should follow from that I should be willing to accept accountability to that party that I want to help us. That's what has been missing. Obligations are taken, but never fulfilled. Nobody asks. That's what's wrong with the process.
Have you seen, you said you hope with Prime Minister Netanyahu, have you seen any evidence yet in the right direction?
I think it is important that now we're not speculating any longer about whether or not he accepts the two-state solution. That's overdue. Mm-hmm. And I would like to remind everybody that that's something that was acknowledged by the government of Israel in June of 2003, 6 years ago, by a government headed by Ariel Sharon, and on which Benjamin Netanyahu sat as finance minister. Nevertheless, we are where we are today. And by the way, it was a much more forthcoming endorsement of the George W. Bush's vision than what we heard recently. Nevertheless, I'm pleased that we do not have to speculate any longer on whether or not the government of Israel accepts the two-state solution. But now that we have gotten to this point of it not being a matter of speculation, I think the issue is, what are we going to do in order to fulfill that, in order to actually translate that into reality? Mr. Netanyahu is right to look at us and say, what are you doing, Palestinians, to live up to your obligations? I'm happy to answer. That which we're doing right and that which we're doing half right, that which we are not delivering, and what it is we're going to do about that. At the same time, I hope he will spend equal time looking at what his government has to do in order to deliver. What I hope will be uniformly well understood is the following. I do not want, and I think it will be devastating, if this international drive led by the United States to achieve at long last durable and just peace in the region, I hope it will not be seen as the United States taking sides with this side or that side. I hope this will be seen for what it is. The United States decidedly taking sides with the notion of maintaining the viability of a two-state solution. A solution concept that has become matter of international consensus. the only solution concept that makes sense. That's what this is about, and I think we all should unite behind that effort, and everyone should contribute in that direction.
Thank you. I know we have a lot of we have questions, and I'm going to go to them with one last one. There's been a big earthquake in the region in the last month, and that is the attempted revolution, whatever it was, in Iran, and the shaking of the Iranian Islamic Republic. What shockwaves, if any, have hit Gaza, West Bank, Palestine, because of that revolution? Do you sense Hamas being weakened, tempered by it? What's been the impact?
It's an event of interest, I can tell you for sure. It will be certainly, at least that's my sense. Yeah. You know, one of those events in history that later in life, I do not know how long it will take, when it will happen. It will prove to have been extremely significant in the history of the region. I think it's important. You know, I wish the Iranian people all the justice and democracy they deserve, like all nations around the world. And I think it's very important for the government of Iran to understand fully well that it is important for it, first and foremost, to look after the interests of its citizens, real interests of its citizens, and leave the rest of us alone.
Well said. Karim Kouar, the former Jordanian ambassador to Washington.
Thank you, Tom. Mr. Prime Minister, in follow-up to Tom's question regarding elections, 6 months is not a very long time. My question is, what would you specifically ask of the stakeholders in the peace process and the regional players to do that would help the Palestinian people see that there's improvement and there's deliverables from your moderate government side that can help change Palestinian public opinion to continue to support moderate leadership in the upcoming elections?
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Karim. Good question.
There are several things. One is to continue to help us do which we have been able to do over the past couple of years, over the next 6 months. For the next 6 months to be a continuation of a period in which we actually, in the public's perception, to the way they see and assess things, was a period of considerable success in turning things around, particularly in security, but also bringing about elements, beginning of an economic recovery. On the strength of government intervention, yes, but also helped with some important initiatives like the public-private initiative sponsored by the Aspen Institute, and I'm grateful to them. Being here, especially, I should mention that. Several other things happened, actually, to make this begin to happen. I think it's important to maintain the support that made that possible. At the same time, to deal with our other elements of weakness, elements that produced the outcome of elections in 2006 they produced, people have to really begin to see this political process deliver. Because that's, in other words, the horizon thing, beginning with deliverables on the ground. You know, people talk, for example, when we say stop settlement activity, you know, words to someone who really has not seen what settlement activity is or is about. Look, built-up area of settlements, the actually built-up area of settlements in the West Bank, depending on who's doing the counting, we say 1.7% of the land mass. Israel says a little bit more, not much more, but 1.7% of the land mass of the West Bank. But guess how much of the West Bank is off-limit to the Palestinian population because of settlements? 40%. Because security and what has to happen and all of that. I know, and I invite those of you who actually visit there to go out and see neighborhoods, to see rural areas that have been deprived completely of access to their farmland, to livelihood. If people actually begin to see seriousness in the direction of ensuring that requirements for success, obligations, commitments are being fulfilled, both by their government, our government, but also importantly by Israel, they begin to believe that this path is going to really take us someplace. You know, compare that and contrast it with a period when people have to wait endlessly, hour to hours, patiently, not impatiently, but certainly enduring a lot of humiliation in the process. Contrast, this context against a context where there is a breakup in this, there is change for the better. I think this will contribute to beginning to putting people back in a better state of mind about the future. And that's what you really need. You need other elements. You need for us to really actually do more in the governance sphere, and that's why I recently called for stepping up the effort for reinvigorating it, to really actually get it over with, for the government to deliver competently, fairly, improve governance wherever we can. So if they see all of these things, I think chances are they'll vote differently. Do I know this for sure? I don't know that for sure, but I think it gives us much better context in which to operate.
Thank you. Let's try to get through as many questions as we can. Jim Woolsey, former CIA director.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for your remarks, especially those about the rule of law in a future Palestinian state. Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister, the new foreign minister of Israel, called for not long ago a special loyalty oath for Israel's Arab citizens. And I think that's been retreated from, but nonetheless that produced understandably a great deal of negative reaction, probably almost everybody here and certainly myself. But it calls to mind the situation of the Israeli Arabs. There are about 1 million of them, citizens of Israel within the 1967 borders, about a sixth of the population. They are not treated in all ways, I think, as equivalent to Jewish or other citizens of Israel, but generally they enjoy the guarantees that Americans look for in the Bill of Rights. They have freedom of religion, they can build mosques, you hear the muezzins calling from the minarets in Jaffa as you walk around Tel Aviv, they have freedom of speech, they have freedom of press, they have representatives in the Knesset, they have a Supreme Court justice, until recently they had a cabinet member, and most importantly, they can go to bed at night without worrying that someone's going to kick down the door and kill them. Now, if there is to be the rule of law in a Palestinian state, and if Jews want to live in some place like Hebron or any place else in the Palestinian state for whatever personal reasons or historical attachments, why should they not be treated the same way Israeli Arabs are? That would be that there could be a sixth of the population consisting of them. They could vote for real representatives in a real Palestinian legislature, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and most importantly, able to go to sleep at night without worrying that someone's going to kick down the door and kill them. Any other treatment of them, I would suggest, would be what Pat Moynihan used to call defining deviancy down for the Palestinians, and in his mind, that was not acceptable.
I do not disagree with you, and I'm not someone who would say that they will or should be treated differently than Israeli Arabs are treated in Israel. I wouldn't. In fact, the kind of state that we long to have, that we aspire to have, is one that would definitely aspire, that espouses high values of tolerance, coexistence, mutual respect and deference to all cultures, religions, no discrimination whatsoever on any basis whatsoever. This is a matter of record. I said those words in Arabic on the 21st of last month near Jerusalem, and we're committed to those. That's the kind of state that we want to have. Jews, to the extent they choose to stay and live in the state of Palestine, will enjoy those rights and certainly would not enjoy any less rights than Israeli Arabs are enjoying now in the state of Israel.
Thank you.
Martin Indyk, former U.S. ambassador to Israel.
Hey, Martin, I didn't know you were here.
Salam. Mr. Prime Minister.
You got some good questioners out there.
You provoked all of us. First of all, thank you for yet again making such an articulate and courageous presentation of what needs to be done. But what I was struck by in your very articulate exposition of the approach was, if I were Bibi Netanyahu in the audience, I'd be saying, yes, exactly, that's the approach that I want to pursue, what he calls economic peace, what you call a kind of bottom-up building of institutions, and I know you're particularly interested in the economic side of that. What else needs to be happening at the same time? You talk about a 2-year time horizon. Should there be final status negotiations at the same time? Is that important to the process that you are describing? Or should it wait until 2 years from now when you've achieved the state building that you're attempting? What else needs to go into this package in the next 2 years?
Yeah, it's an effort on the political track of things. Although, speaking candidly, this was about putting together a government platform. I tell you the genesis of this 2 years because I was asked a lot about it, after I said it, especially by the writers, newspapers and all, and I'm trying to promote the idea and explain it better. And, people were really focused on this. Why 2 years? And the honest answer to this is, it's something I had intended to say long before Netanyahu gave his speech. It was around the time we put together the most recent government. We wanted to have a government program that made sense, not one that's done in a rush and done pro forma. I wanted something that is related to, the task of getting us to freedom, to statehood and all. And if you think in those terms, you clearly need a timeline. You cannot just basically say, we want to build towards statehood forever. So you needed to have a little bit of a timeline, an indication of when you think that can happen. Technical judgment, based on my, I believe, intimate knowledge of the inner workings with the PA, and how far along we have come, and how much more we need to go further along to get there. I thought a 2-year period was reasonable. It may be a challenging task, nevertheless is doable. It happens to be also consistent with what I thought, may take in terms of length of time to really get things going on the political track, and I guess that's what I really need to say. What should go in parallel with the effort to build towards statehood and build that economic peace, which we do not disagree with, to the contrary, is a serious effort on the political track to put this in the right context. The risk otherwise, for this to be a plan that is not a plan, because a plan without a timeline is just simply not a plan, the risk also is for this to be seen as an effort to make the occupation work better and not to end it. And thereby really doing away with any political viability that our political leadership still has. So I thought that the timeline served the dual purpose of, on the one hand, responding objectively to what it is that's required to happen institutionally speaking, governance-wise, in terms of structures and processes, but also politically to throw that bridge, that link between the building towards statehood and the political track, which has to really be pursued. You refer to it as negotiation of permanent status. I call it a political process, leading first to a meeting of the minds as to what needs to obtain by way of parameters and settlements, but then to really actually go out and negotiate the deals of what needs to happen. I think 2-year period is long enough time for this to happen. Focusing on the track of governance, I say we do the best we can. It's not that we are going to sit on our hands and see the beauty of this, if I may. I'm biased, for this approach, is that it's not that we sit there and do nothing unless there is political progress. We are going to really be very, very busy trying to do all of these things that I'm really telling you we're going to do. And what we're really counting on is a meaningful political process that's capable of ending the occupation, because building the institutions of the state by itself is not going to end the occupation. It's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. So both, complement each other. Both have to really work along together. That's what I think.
Thank you.
Well, I'm neither an ambassador or an ex-CIA director, but I am a concerned...
Why are you always speaking from the left, though?
I am a concerned American Jew and a concerned citizen. I heard you this morning and this afternoon, and I have to say that, first of all, I'm extraordinarily impressed with what you've done, and more so, I have more hope than I've ever had before, certainly in many years, and I thank you for that. You said this morning... You said this morning, and I was struck by this, that the Arab nations have significantly reduced the amount of funding that they're providing to your government. And I was struck and quite distressed by that. And the question is, and particularly as an American, since we're transferring so much wealth to Arab oil-producing states, aren't your Arab neighbors really letting you down? Shouldn't they be fulfilling their commitments to you in ways that they're not? Thank you.
I don't know if I really would want to say more about this than I said before, for fear that we'll get less money. Anyway, no, let me say the following. Arab countries have provided us with generous assistance over the years for decades. There's no question about that. The observation that I made this morning related to our experience both in 2008, 2009. Now that experience, I do not believe, it's up to Arab donors to actually characterize or give reasons as to why they're acting the way they have acted. It's their prerogative. But personally, I believe it has something to do with our own internal politics, with our own internal situation. Arab countries are not happy with the state of separation, with the state of Palestinian division. And they're not comfortable, operating in an environment like that. And I say this, and I think with a fair degree of confidence. For why else would that be? It's not lack of resources, but it's lack of enthusiasm, to get involved in a situation where it appeared to them that Palestinians are at it again, fighting amongst each other, when in fact we want them united. It may be that the thinking there that this will induce us to do that which is right from their point of view, and by the way, from ours too. We don't like the state of division any more than they dislike it. There's no question about that. I believe that has something to do with it. Now, has it hurt us? Yes, it has, because our capacity to function has been undermined by the decline in assistance. And to tell you the truth, and speaking very, very candidly and openly, did we offer, Arab countries, did we Palestinians offer Arab countries, or the world community at large for that matter, something that looked like a good bet to support, in mid-2007? I would not have bet on us in mid-2007. And that's why, I'm telling you, we always, have to look in the mirror. We always have to start with that which we have to do ourselves. But now that we really have managed to achieve and accomplish a major turnaround, and in the process, believe me, the most important deliverable of all is the improvement in the, can-do attitude on the part of the Palestinian public that has accompanied this turnaround in performance. Having gone this far, I ask respectfully all of our friends and neighbors to really give us a hand. That's the time to do it. If we were not a good bet before, I think we worked on it. I hope we are a better bet today than we were then. Now is the time to really stand by us and help us. This, if anything, actually will help us with the effort to reunite and not to stay separated, but again on principles that happen to be right and enduring.
Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the hour is late and many hot dogs are about to be roasted. So I just want to say I've always had a motto about the Middle East, at least for these last 15 years or so, is that extremists go all the way and moderates tend to just go away. And what is so heartening about what you've had to say here and what I know you're doing on the ground and what I've also seen now happening around the region is that the moderates have stopped going away. They're starting to dig in. They're starting to hold their ground and actually press their position. And I couldn't agree more that now is the time for the rest of the moderates around the world to be helping you. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Really a pleasure. didn't know you were